Okay, so speaking about love, okay, there's three levels of love. In every language, there's three levels of love. The first level of love is like in English we'd say, do you like? You like me? Do you love me? But then the third level of love is worship. Do you love me? Do you like me? Do you worship me? Okay? And Jesus is doing the same thing here, asking Peter, well, Peter, do you like me? Well, sure, yeah, I like you. Well, but Peter, do you love me? Well, sure, Lord, I love you. You know I love you. Peter, now, do you worship me? Oh, well, no, wait a minute, Lord. Worship is only for God. We only worship God. Right, Peter, do you worship me? How are you going to answer? You know that Jesus is the Son of God. Are you willing to accept him as equal to the Father? To worship him? The same type of worship with which you worship the Father, are you willing to worship the Son? You see, now when Jesus was walking among them on the earth, he never required that of them. It was enough that they loved him. But now that he has done all that his Father asked him to do, Peter, now do you worship me? And I want you to know that Jesus is worthy of our worship. We don't worship each other, but we can and should worship Jesus Christ the same as we worship the Father. Okay? Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love you. And so Peter drops back down into that love word again, and Jesus says to him, "Feed my sheep." Oh no, the third time. Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love you. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Okay, so verily. Okay, so now Jesus gives a prophecy to Peter. He said, "When you were young, you put on your own clothes and you walked wherever you wanted to go. But when you'll be old, you shall stretch forth your hands, and another will gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not go." Okay? He said, somebody else is going to tie you up, and then they're going to take you someplace where you don't want to go. And thus spake he, signifying the death he should glorify, by what death he should glorify God. And but he said, "Follow me." And so Peter was left to follow Jesus. Well, then Peter makes an interesting observation. He says, "Then Peter, turning about, sees the disciples whom Jesus loved." In other words, he saw John standing there, which had leaned on his breast at supper, and said, "Lord, which is he that betrayed thee?" We know that. Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what shall this man do?" And Jesus said unto him, "If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me." Okay, so Jesus is telling Peter, I've given him a promise that he can tarry, that he'll be around when I come back again. And who knew then that it would be over 2,000 years before Jesus came back again, or around 2,000 years before Jesus would come back again. And so John is testifying of things, and he wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Of course, he knows his testimony is true. He was eyewitness to everything that's going on here. And there were also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if thou shouldest be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Amen. Okay, so that's the book of John. So let's talk a little bit about John. So John didn't die. So let me review a little bit of the history of John after the book closed. Okay, John went out and, what happened to the disciples? First of all, after Jesus came, talked to him here, they were all recommitted to doing the work of the Lord. For a time, the disciples worked in Jerusalem, and but then there was also another time when they were expelled from Jerusalem. The persecution became so intense among Christians that the Christians were advised to leave Jerusalem and go find other places to live, which they did. And the people got scattered. Jesus said, "Ye are the salt of the earth," and Jesus made sure that he scattered the salt all over the place. And Christians were going out into different towns and different cities and in other places in the world, and they were started to travel, and the disciples started ministry, and there was a traveling ministry, and so on. And at some point in time, the disciples got together and divided up the Roman world into 12 parts, or maybe it should have been 12 parts, and then they sent out the disciples to go, each one in his own direction. It's worth it to look up online and see what happened to all the other disciples. And maybe another time we can talk about it. We're talking about John today. So we come to a point in time when John was taken captive by the Romans, and he was persecuted. And one of the things that they tried to do to kill him is that they threw him into a pot of boiling oil, and he came out unscarred. And it was a miracle. It was a miracle that was known about back in the early days of the church. It's not a miracle that too many people know about these days. I was surprised about reading that I was probably 50 years old the first time that I heard that John had been thrown into a pot of boiling oil. So it's one of those things that just kind of slipped under the carpet. Well, so then, for a time, John was a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos, and he was there. That's where he wrote the book of Revelation. And but then when the emperor died, who had put him there, was gone, he was able to leave his confinement. He went back to work in the ministry. In the book of Revelation, it talks about John being in charge of 7 churches in what's called today Asia Minor. And that was his ministry. Or at least it was the ministry while he was being exiled. He was doing his ministry evidently by letters, since he wasn't able to travel around. But that was his ministry for a time. And as the other disciples died, and there were groups of people that needed to be visited, John started to go around to visit the other, the little churches that had been built up by other disciples, and to try to, just basically to keep things going. But John was still under persecution for a long time, okay? And at some point in time, and this is just a history that the Lord showed me, you aren't going to see it written anywhere, but a little history that the Lord told me that at some point in time, John took a companion whose name was also John. And so at the time he took this other companion, they looked like they were both about the same age, and they were both named John. And then, when they would go in, only the older people who knew which one was John the disciple and or John the apostle and who was the other John, as long as they were around, but they were told not to tell which one was which. The two Johns are coming into town, okay? And so they treated him as one, right? Well, the other guy, every year he looked older and older and older and older and older. And finally, the other John died, okay? And so the Roman authorities were called in, and, they were told that John was dead. And so, everybody assuming that the older guy was the apostle because he was the one that had been with Jesus, right? And so they assumed that the older one was John the apostle, right? And so they just let the Romans believe what they wanted to believe. John is dead. The report got back and to Rome, and John is dead. Okay, yay, John is dead. And so after that, John was able to travel around.